Yes!
Welcome to the Femsplainers. I'm Danielle Crittenden.
And I'm Christina Hoff-Summers.
And welcome, Christina, you're in Portland again, seeing your mom, and we're getting all kinds of nice comments, hoping your mom's okay.
My
Mrs. Hoff.
mom's doing okay, but I'm spending a lot of time in Portland. I'm sort of bonding with that city. I might move there.
And then you can hang out finally with your favorite people, lesbian separatists.
Lesbian separatists, my people, smoking and drinking. I went to meet my sister at a restaurant, but it's Portland, so there was a band and there was dancing. It was all like baby boomers, hippie baby boomers, my people, dancing. And I got asked to dance.
What?
Yeah, just walking through the restaurant.
By a man or a lesbian?
A guy, kind of a hairy guy.
How old?
I don't know, 60.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
A young man.
I've given up on all that. I don't think if I went alone to a bar, anyone would ask me to
they would there.
Maybe.
Actually anywhere, but especially there.
I'll get the woman asking me. I just know it.
I once went to a lesbian bar with my girlfriend in the 80s. No, it's actually the 70s with Joyce, because we just wanted to be alone, and every place we went, men were hassling us. So we went to, I forget what the name of it, she'll remember, just to talk and smoke and drink and be with each other. And then I got asked to dance. And Joyce said, she can't. She's with me. And there was a little situation, so.
Well, I remember a young woman complaining to me fairly recently. I think she was sort of, greggered up with the Me Too stuff. She got very angry that she was walking past a group of men and they whistled at her. And she said, I'm just going to the store and I can't go to the store without being whistled at. And I just looked at her and said, don't worry, it stops.
Yes. I remember going to Italy just about 10 years ago. And when I'd gone there a lot when I was younger, and the men were such a problem. And then I went back.
They're not a problem.
They weren't a problem, and I was a little disappointed.
I once read an essay about sort of praise of the wolf whistle. And as a young woman, she felt she only got whistled at when she was feeling great, that there was something uplifting about her, and she was walking along, and then there'd be a whistle, and she found it affirming of her mood and her youth, and not sort of oppressive and creepy.
No, well, I was this was about 10 years ago, and I was all dressed up, and I felt pretty good. And I went into a store, and this cute guy behind the counter just said, well, hi there, Miss Sex in the City. And it, improved my mood.
Well, this leads us into one of the things we wanted to talk about. We're supposed to be in a rage now as women.
It's the new thing, fury feminism.
It's not even angry women. It's
furious,
raging women.
Enraged. And Rebecca Traister has a book about it. And there are 2 books on rage. There have been a series of unhinged op-eds. Just last weekend, there's this woman in the Washington Post. Thanks for not raping us, all of you good men, ironically. But it's not enough. And she speaks of having screeched at her husband for 30 minutes.
She's old, right? Like she's older. She's been married.
A retired professor.
She's 70.
And she's 70. Right? And she's in a state.
They've been married for like 40 years or something.
And to this nice guy who then just sort of, slumps down into a puddle. And she's still screeching at him. And I think this has to stop. And here's what bothers me about it. I've written about this. There was so much promise initially, and maybe there still will be, in the Me Too movement. But that's something men and women do together to bring the world up to 21st century standards of dignity and respect. And men are allies in this, not the enemy. And there's a contingent of women that want to blame the entire male species.
Well, what I found surprising about that story was it wasn't just, the usual angry radical screed in some obscure feminist publication, but it was in the Washington Post by a woman who had been married to a man that she goes on to describe has been lovely, supportive, empowering, pro-women. And she claims like she just lost, he said something, he's probably like, where's my glasses or something? And she went nuts. And
then why would the Post...
But she's justifying her. But the thing about that is, I got enraged at him, but it's not like she then said, and then I felt embarrassed, and how could I yell and hector this amazing man?
She's just getting started.
She justified it.
You bastard, she says. She wants men to organize to
To what?
I don't know, to change. You know what bothers me too is men have organized and done magnificent things for women in our society where women have rights. That's because men cooperated and empowered us and created a world where women are overall reasonably safe compared to other parts of the world. No gratitude for the good things that men have done. They take the worst exemplars of toxic masculinity and make them the symbol for all mankind. That is bigotry.
Well, I just know my strategy next time David forgets to take out the garbage. I can bring up my feminist rage at him.
It's very effective.
Thank you for not smoking. Thank you for not raping.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
You bastard.
In other news, the thing that caught me this past week was from the CBC Canadian.
Oh, a Canadian story.
Canadian, pardon me, that a transgender Canadian woman sets off debate after winning cycling world championship. Now, there have been a number of these stories when a transgendered woman enters professional or even college.
Yes.
And I think even high school
Yes.
sports, and then proceeds to wipe out all of the non-transgendered female competitors.
Yeah. There is an effort, and the feminists have been silenced. They don't really know what to say. And anybody that speaks up is called, I forget what it stands for, a TERF. What is a TERF? Can you look that up and find out what
Zoe's here. Zoe's going to look
you.
up a TERF. It's not a MILF, though.
MILF. And I think
TERF.
I might be GILF, grandmother.
As long as you're still being asked to dance.
I'm still being asked to dance.
TERF stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist.
Trans-exclusionary. What's that?
My group, the group I bond with,
The lesbian separate.
they're lesbian separatists. And they really don't like men, and they especially don't like men who want to be women.
It says that it's a term that's used to describe feminists who oppose the inclusion of trans people in female spaces and organizations.
Yes, like the Hampstead Pond in London is where just women can swim. And it's been, it's historic women, and then men have their ponds.
This just goes back to like separate clubs.
Little things that we enjoy doing and don't want men there. And now they're frightened because...
But then if men had their clubs where they just wanted to smoke cigars and drink cognac and not be bothered by women, like something out of P.G. Wodehouse,
Yes.
they wouldn't be allowed that. But the women who want their clubs with their swimming pools and we're allowed that doesn't make sense.
None of it makes sense. And I think a lot of it, for example, with the athletes, there is a pugilist, I guess, mixed martial arts expert, Fallon Fox, and I won't dead name her because I don't know the name. But Fallon was in a match with a woman who'd been the leading, female in mixed martial arts, and she was practically beaten to death.
Right.
At what point are we going to say this is absurd, and that maybe, most of us want to be kind and understanding and tolerant and not be mean to people, but this seems to me to be, it's moving too fast, and it's going to eliminate opportunities for female athletes.
And it's going to wipe out.
Wait a minute. Wait, what do we even call them? Because they don't want to use the word woman. So there's one cancer research institute in the UK, and they tweeted that cervical screening for anyone with a cervix between 25 and 64, and apparently they want inclusive language, which might mean calling women menstruators.
Oh, God.
Or I guess I'm a cervical.
I'm not checking that. But what if
You're a cervical American or a gyno American?
What if you're post?
Oh yeah, ooh, yeah. That seems like that's
what am I trying to say?
elder exclusionary. It's ageist.
Menopause. Postmenopause. You're in
We
menopause.
don't know that word.
No, but what does that make men? Ejaculators?
Ooh.
But that could discriminate against certain men too.
Those with
Yeah.
and the incels that apparently don't do it. Well, maybe they do that.
The non-sexually
by
active.
themselves. The onanists.
I don't know. I think to go back to the transgendered in sports, this is just clearly going to wipe out women's sports.
It's already, they're winning the prizes in cycling and in track, and we saw mixed martial arts.
Well, it also just strikes me as the way that, you would be number whatever, 10th, 100th in the Olympic competition, and this is a way for you to become number one by just
I mean, men can take
changing
over
your
trans,
quote-unquote gender.
but I have to use the right word now. So here's the conceptual debate. When we say a trans woman, do we mean it's a man who identifies as a woman, or do we mean, as some of the activists want, a trans woman? It's like saying a blonde woman or a tall woman. It's just an ordinary variable that we associate with women. So it's a different kind of woman. So that's why they want it in the sports. But that different kind of woman is going to require a radical transformation of language and the elimination of the concept of a woman, really.
Do you think this will all just collapse upon itself? I mean, it's just getting so complicated.
Well, what percentage of the population do you think
knows about this?
No,
or even cares?
Well, they're going to care. They might not care, but it cares about them, and this topic cares about them. So it's going to come into our schools and sports. The best study that I saw, but someone can send me something else, about 0.5% of the population. And I can imagine all sorts of humane accommodations and understanding. And one of my good friends is trans, as they say. But this seems to me to be with the sports. It hasn't been thought through.
It seems that they will take anybody's word for saying, I'm a trans, therefore I can compete. So it's kind of a way just for anybody who decides they want to compete in a women's sport to get
Anybody
in.
can
There's
do
no
it.
test. They don't check under your...
I was giving
Yes.
a lecture at Suffolk University in Boston, and there were some angry people in the back that came to protest, and then they came forward, and a trans, I don't know what to call this person. He had a beard and clearly a guy, but he was wearing like a pinafore and little, totally, he was just dressed up like a woman, but no effort to look like a woman.
Good.
He was kind of a cute guy without the dress. I liked him. But then
Come on, at least do your hair and
makeup. When he left, someone said, oh, well, he was mad. She was mad. And I referred to him accidentally as he. And then they were very mad at me. But it was hard to remember because he didn't make an effort. I think if they make an effort and they look like a woman, then you automatically think they were women.
I think it was the comedian John Mulaney. Do you ever listen to him? And he has this riff on trans women in San Francisco. And he says, he was walking by through the Tenderloin and all these trans women out. And he goes, I'm all for trans and this is all fine. But what I don't understand is when they dress up as women, they all become the same type of woman. And she's mean. And she makes nasty comments like, look at that little man. He says, they're never women that are nice or you want to get to know.
Well,
there's a kind of cartoony
I met pretty ones
version of women.
at Max's Kansas City in the late 60s. And they were beautiful. In fact, one of them gave me beauty lessons. I was I think it was Candy Darling. And I went into the ladies' room, and I was sort of a hippie, long hair, no makeup. She said, you could be a very attractive girl, but you need makeup. And she said, you just go to Bloomingdale's right now to the counter. And I said to her, well, I like the natural look. She said, natural? She said, I like the totally artificial look. And I was so surprised.
See, but she made a personal comment to you. And
she was gorgeous.
Yeah, but I don't think, real women really do that. I think, I'll have to look it up, but Nora Ephron wrote a great essay expanding on this John Mulaney theory. And I think she may have been even writing about, was it Sir Edmund Hillary the traveler, the famous Jan Morris.
Jan Morris.
From James Morris, right?
Yes.
He was a very manly man, explorer, writer, and then he became a woman. And Nora Ephron went to interview him. And she came away with that same impersonation that these men who are becoming women, and maybe Kris Jenner is like this, they're not really like women, aside from looking like linebackers in bras and skirts. Right. She wrote that they're like cartoons of women. They're exaggerations of what they think femininity is. But all of like the sacrifice part and putting yourself first for others, that all of the sort of traits.
This was interesting. They bring in the aggression
Right.
And so we may have
Raging women.
No, a social justice movement that without this civilizing influence of women, you've got the male aggression.
And they're not only just going to be raging, they're going to be taking other men out. Like, can you imagine that scene with that wife? Like, she's angry. She's just gonna punch him.
Oh, yeah. Well, maybe that's the argument, though. That it just should be a different category of person, depending on what they want. If they want to go all the way and be like Candy Darling was a beautiful woman, I had to look twice, and then I realized that she was, well, I don't know.
Was she willing to drive a minivan with 6 screaming children in it and broken goldfish back and forth to school every day? I don't think so.
No.
Anyway, well, before we bring on our guest, and introduce our guest, I just want you to ask me, I don't want to become a bore about this, but just ask me how Sober October is going.
How's it going?
Great!
I know, and I'm joining you.
It's great!
I was overserved on Saturday night at a bonfire in Portland, and I didn't feel good, and now I'm allergic to wine.
Well, I'm not allergic to wine. As listeners know, I've given up wine, but in my cup that says not wine is a little bit today of cognac.
And you did give me this bottle.
I gave you Saint-Germain.
Which is beguiling. It tastes like wine.
But this sort of gets us through the podcast as we realize we need it.
It's for my voice. I do it for my voice.
But I have to say, it took me like 10 days to get out of just the habit of that beautiful glass of wine at the end of the day, and then that second beautiful glass of wine with dinner, and then that third beautiful glass of wine.
And then the little aperitif.
And then the digestif. And but then once I got through the
But what do you have in its place?
Usually I'll have a slug of whiskey.
Okay.
And then that does it. I don't need wine. And the sirens have stopped singing to me, like calling to me at 5:00, like wine, wine, wine.
Yes.
And then I'm sleeping better. Mm-hmm. It's crazy how well I'm sleeping. I remember my dreams. I could become one of those dream bores and start telling you about all the dreams.
Never tell anyone your dreams, ever. They don't want to hear them.
Can I tell you one dream? It is funny. You'll appreciate this.
If it's funny.
It is funny.
It's a Canadian telling a joke. Never mind.
Get out of the pool. So I woke up from yet another vivid dream that I remembered, and I'd been in this beautiful boutique, and I was trying on this fabulous and crazy expensive coat.
Ooh.
And David walked into the boutique, and he said, "That is a fabulous coat. You have to buy that. You have to have that." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Yes." And then I woke up and I told him the dream, and he said, "That's why there's this phrase, only in your dreams." So much for that. But anyway, okay, our guest, Christina, you know this guest very well. Greg Lukianoff.
Greg Lukianoff, a brilliant young man, a Stanford Law School graduate who focused on constitutional law, free speech activist who took over FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. And he is the president, or I don't know, the CEO.
He's the president.
President. And he is doing an excellent job. Unfortunately, for the world, they were doing very well. They really try to restore free speech policies on campus.
They have a website, and then they sort of sponsor.
If a school violates the First Amendment and tries to censor a speaker or shut down a professor.
Left or right?
Left or right.
Yeah.
They're bipartisan. That's why I like this group, because they protect speech no matter who's threatening it. And threats come from both sides. And FIRE will... they'll send a letter. Usually a letter's enough to scare the school to change. But they have lawyers, and they are growing. And if you are even tempted, anyone listening, tempted to give money to a university, first, check out their free speech policy. If you don't like it, if they have microaggression lists or speech codes, give the money to FIRE.
Fire.org. He's also the co-author with Jonathan Haidt of The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. He's kind of doing, remember we had Kim Brooks on, the author of Small Animals, who talked about the negative effects that helicopter parenting was having. Right. And he takes that idea even further and talks specifically about iGen, which apparently not all millennials are the same.
Yeah, not all millennials are snowflakes.
And not all millennials are millennials because, for instance, Zoe here is part of iGen.
Yeah, born after
1995 or born in 1995.
What year were you born, if I may ask? She's looking it up.
I'm a 96er.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
iGen.
So she's iGen.
We have to be careful around her.
And apparently the distinction is that was the first generation to grow up with the iPhone and that idea that the world is in your pocket at all times.
And also, they weren't free range. I mean, when they give speeches, they'll ask the audience, anybody over a certain age, over 40, like, what time did you have to be home
right
at night when you were a kid? In my generation, it was like at dark. I mean, we could go out, and our parents didn't know where we were all day.
Right.
And now parents know, and they arrange everything. The child has very little free time.
Right.
And they get to college, and they want that to continue.
Or they don't really, as he will talk about or writes about, they don't really know how to be on their own.
You know, they've had all these bullying programs which taught them that it was a really big deal.
Yeah.
You know, if someone insulted you and they come to college and someone argues with them and they feel triggered, and they have data to show increased anxiety and depression, especially among girls.
Anyway, so that's Greg. He's coming on to talk about this. And he'll actually be in the studio, so we won't...
He has a cold.
No, he has a cold, but at least he won't have the phone that Helen Pluckrose had that last week, which we all apologize for. That was her underwater phone. I think Helen was talking to us from the bottom of the sea.
Yeah, and either she couldn't hear us or we couldn't hear her. We tried our best.
We did our best, but this time he's in studio, and let's welcome him.
Take good care of my baby. Please don't ever make her blue. Just tell her that you love her. Make sure you're thinking of her in everything you say and do.
Welcome to the Femsplainers.
Hi, Christina.
Thank you for coming into the studio with poor Greg. We've got him a mint tea.
And he's not well.
He's not well.
I'm almost. I thought I was 100% this morning, but not quite there yet.
Well, we thought you might not be well because of this very depressing book you've written and spending so much time studying this whole, not just the PC culture on colleges, but what led to it, the rising anxiety and depression amongst young people.
It can be depressing to study it.
Super depressing.
It can be. There's a reason why we open it up on a lighter note with sort of a funny story, a way of getting into it, because we wanted something that was a little less serious before we got into some.
What is the story? I forget.
The story is about a mythical journey that Haidt and I took, John Haidt and I took to Greece to talk to the great oracle Misoponos, and he gives us. Where they are seeking wisdom, and he proceeds to give us 3 of the worst pieces of advice we'd ever heard in our lives. And that was kind of like the premise of the original article that I wrote with Haidt back in 2015, is just that I feel like we are giving a generation of people, whether intentionally or not, the worst advice they could possibly get.
Well, this came out of your article that was published in The Atlantic, I believe. And the bad advice, which you begin with, this book is about 3 great untruths.
So Misoponos hosts us, and he tells us, we asked for 3 pieces of wisdom from him, and he says, well, first of all, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. And we're like, and then the next one is, your feelings are always right. And we're like, should we say something? And then the third one is, life is a battle between good people and evil people. And we're both like, that's the worst advice we ever heard in our lives. Like, you're like, surely you must have misspoke. It's a way of setting up the idea that generally it's not as if we're intending to give this advice, but in the way we behave, we are often giving this advice.
To children, to students,
to younger,
and it continues
to younger
into
people.
college.
Oh, it absolutely does. Usually when John and I present together, I take the second one, the emotional reasoning one, your feelings are always right. Because that's the one that, we originally had that one first, because it's the one that sounds the most sort of attractive. It sounds romantic. It sounds... because
Sounds true to me,
Yeah.
my feelings, myself.
There's a Susan David. I'm always kind of jealous of her. She's a psychologist who wrote a book whose name I can't remember at the moment, but she boiled this down so well. She said, your feelings are information, not direction. You should never just do what your feelings tell you to completely uncritically. I mean, okay, yeah, fine. If a bear is coming at you, that's a totally different. If you're in system 1 brain, sure. But for me, like I'm pretty, I get into some pretty grisly detail in the book about my own issues with depression, and a lot about overcoming depression, particularly in the school of thought of, well, for that matter, Buddhism, Stoicism.
Mencius.
Mencius,
and cognitive
behavioral therapy or acceptance and commitment therapy, all of these really effective interventions for anxiety and depression, is to say that when you're feeling sad, you shouldn't necessarily go looking for all the justifications for why you're depressed. It's okay to it's actually a really good mature habit to talk back to some of your more exaggerated thoughts. But I feel like on campus we're really telling people, that anxiety you're feeling, that must mean you're in great danger.
Or somehow oppressed or discriminated against. But let's go back to put this in context, really for your inspiration for this book, that you noticed something,
yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong, you noticed something very interesting around 2013.
Yep.
And that's when the language of, we use these all the time.
Trigger warning. Microaggression.
Intersectionality, the beginning of these sort of mass disinvitations to speakers on campuses. And you really saw that coming up starting at around 2013. And you thought it was different because, Christina, I remember the 90s, and there was a lot of this stuff on campuses then, but you noticed something distinctly different.
Well, I was in school towards the tail end. I went to college in '92. And I was at kind of the tail end of the first great wave of political correctness, which was like the late 80s, early 90s. And I started at FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, as the legal director in 2001. And by 2001, the students were actually the best constituency on campus for free speech. Like, they got you didn't have a right to be offended. They got the idea. They were big fans of Dave Chappelle. They got it. So for all of my actual career up until 2013, I took for granted that the students were actually your best bet if you wanted to appeal to someone on free speech.
Yeah, especially like the South Park generation, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Beavis
They grew up.
Beavis and Butthead.
Beavis and Butthead, South Park, exactly.
The Simpsons.
Yeah, but 2013, 2014, it really was like someone flicked a switch. And I was, talking to many of my friends about this. I talked to Hyde about it. Megan McArdle called me did something just happen? And it really did seem like something happened, because that's when you start having the real uptick in disinvitation attempts and, directed just at speakers on campus, directed at Christina sometimes.
Me.
I know. That's when you started hearing students arguing for new speech codes, using microaggressions as the framework. That's when you start hearing about trigger warning policies. Oberlin actually even passed one, which, of course, as soon as the faculty found out about it, they flipped out because it would have made it impossible to teach. Because it also recommended not teaching anything that related to any ism. And, of course, it's like, well, if you live... And the ism, it also included classism, sexism, racism, transphobism. It was like, so the human experience is basically what you're talking about. Don't teach anything related to that. So it seemed to happen really rapidly. And in a sense, the book is a social science detective story to try to figure out what was so different with the students who came in 2013, 2014. And it was amazing what the process of actually finding out kind of that this was a real generational shift was one of the most interesting things about writing the book.
And so what was it?
Well,
Sherlock.
It turns out that the generation is very different. It's iGen, as we call in the book. Students born after 1995 are just different than millennials on a number of different, very measurable scales. And of course, when it comes to actually doing the research, John is much better with statistics than I do. My chief researcher, I always like to give a shout out for Pamela Paretsky, was amazing.
She's wonderful.
Yeah, it was great to work with her on this book. But it all started to fall together if you started looking at the numbers. Now, Jean Twenge, of course, was tremendously helpful in the book. And what you start seeing, now there's some interesting aspects of iGen. Now, John Haidt keeps on saying that we should just give up on iGen. It's not really catching on. I don't really want to quite yet.
Oh, hang on. The phrase or the generation?
Oh, no,
I don't want to give up on them.
The phrase.
Zoe's in the studio is iGen.
Sorry.
It's a Generation Z too, right?
Yeah, he seems to think Generation Z is catching on more. As a Gen Xer, I'm kind of like, we just got like a random variable.
Yeah.
The Gen
But
Xers.
what do you think? Do you like iGen or Gen Z?
Gen Z, I think I only started hearing that after I went to Sarah Lawrence, funny enough. So I don't necessarily, I wrote an article about it that I don't really see why the variables really matter, because I feel like there's a lot
What
of overlap.
comes after Z?
I know.
Oh, no, it's the end of the world, or it's Generation Z.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it can be Generation Z for Zoe. That's
Okay.
there we go.
Your generation.
Yep.
But anyway, whatever we're going to we'll call it iGen for you, Greg. It makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Greg likes it.
Yeah.
I do like it.
We want to keep him happy.
And when and it's interesting, like how you figure out where generation generation start, and you look for discontinuities. And there was a really large discontinuity in things, including when you pass certain normal lifetime milestones. There we go. Yeah, like driving a car, all this kind of stuff. Interestingly, there are actually more conservatives among Gen Z. And when I talk to conservatives about this, they tend to sort of lighten up, and it's like that's at the expense of moderates. In that sense, they kind of reflect our polarized society. That there are fewer moderates, and there are more of both liberals and more or self-described conservatives and liberals. The scariest thing we found out was the discontinuity includes much worse mental health outcomes. These were the scariest stats that we found. Because when we wrote the original article in 2015, I was hearing plenty of stories about how mental health centers were overwhelmed, and it definitely, everything I was hearing was telling me that like something was going on. So we thought, when we got the stats after we wrote the article, they'd be like, 5% bump or something like that. It was so much worse. And when you look at self-reports of mental health, they're triple what they were even just 10 years ago. And I take self-report seriously because turns out if you actually think you're deeply depressed, you're probably deeply depressed, or at least talking yourself into it. But sometimes people will say, oh, it's just the changing of the standards, that maybe they relax the standards for what qualifies as depressed and anxious. And that doesn't explain the really sad facts that we found, that suicide for boys is up by about 25% compared to the first decade of the 21st century, which is terrible. But for girls, it's up 70%, which is catastrophic. I am catastrophizing, as I warn people about, but that is really serious when you see a 70% increase in suicide. So clearly something very serious is going on.
Actual suicides. And so are attempted suicides up too?
Attempts.
Girls do more attempted suicides and boys do more suicides.
There's something interesting in the data there. I think actually that the success, it's a horrible thing to call success rate, but the success rate for girls have gone up, but generally boys do
more violent.
Jumping off buildings, shooting themselves in the head.
Well, to your research, so iGen, if we go with this, because I like it, it means internet generation. And just before you came on,
has explanatory power.
1995, that was the first generation. The iPhone is invented in 2007, or comes into popular use in 2007. Then you note Twitter's 2006, Instagram is 2010, Snapchat is 2011. And then you wrote, it's best to think about the entire period from 2007 to 2012 as the brief span in which the social life of the average teen changed substantially. And you noted that they're just spending so much more time alone, interacting with screens, less times going out with friends while unsupervised by an adult. And then you wrote, by the time they were arriving on campuses in 2013, they'd spent less supervised time and had fewer offline experiences than any previous generation.
Yeah.
And although you point out the positives, that they drink less, smoke less.
We don't have good data on Stone Age people, but we suspect it.
I think they smoked more.
They probably did.
Please join the Femsplainers.
Yes, subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, or your favorite podcast hangout.
And follow us on Instagram at the Femsplainer Podcast.
And find the Femsplainers on Facebook and Twitter at Femsplainers.
And learn all about us at femsplainers.com. Thank you.
Yeah, Femsplainer. We're talking with Greg Lukianoff, co-author with Jonathan Haidt of The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure. You talk about how this results in a very late maturity amongst them, and that part of this campus problem is they don't know how to be alone. Like they don't have those kinds of inner resources or used to even having anything in their lives challenged. So talk a little bit about that.
A quick caveat. One thing we are very clear about in the book, and we spend some pages talking about this, is that we're mostly concerned because of the phenomenon we're seeing about the kind of students who tend to go to elite schools, because that's where we're seeing most of these particular kind of problems. Now, Fire sees free speech issues at schools all across the country, but generally it's like the old-fashioned, the administrator decided to establish a free speech zone. But when it comes to these, microaggression type policies, safe spaces, that kind of stuff, that seems to be more confined to elite colleges, particularly on the coasts, or, as John likes to say, and two in Chicago, not including universities.
And a few in Ohio.
Absolutely, yeah. So we always want to be very, very clear about that.
To be clear, when we're talking about the general statistics of depression and anxiety, that's across the
Right,
board,
exactly.
where you go to a state school or no school at all.
When you think about the kids who are going to these elite schools, this was the reason why I wanted to originally call the book Disempowered. Nobody loved it. I liked it, but I really want to make the point that this is what we're doing to a generation of kids. And I do feel for the kids who have their eyes on the prize of Princeton and Stanford and all this kind of stuff, because they are. It's not. They're, when people hear coddled, they think spoiled. And I'm like, no, I'm not really talking about kids who are spoiled. I'm talking about kids who are trained, or designed like finely honed rockets for one mission only, which is to get them into these schools. But in the name of that, they oftentimes are scheduled from 6 a.m. in the morning to 10 at night, and then they're, on their phones after that. And how incredibly disempowering. We talk a lot about helicopter parenting in the book. It is to show up in where you're supposed to essentially, well, at least, we were traditionally an adult at college without ever having been able to exercise your own autonomy. So I really do have genuine compassion for some of these kids. And this lack of sense of locus of control. If you want to get someone depressed, make them feel like they're not competent enough to do anything on their own. Take away their autonomy. And what we think we're doing to some of these kids that actually contributes to depression as well is implicitly telling them that you can't handle your own life. We have to schedule from morning till night, not giving them the skills to handle it. And it takes away their sense of locus of control. And it leads to the kind of cases that Julie Lythcott-Haims talks about. We interview her in the book as well, in her great book, How to Raise an Adult.
And so on these campuses, they come there and they're already sort of hypersensitive, accustomed to having an adult intervene in every problem that comes up. And so they're in a class and someone says something they don't like, or in the dorm there's some disagreement. And this, at the same time that we have this fragile generation who've been helicopter parents and all of that, they enter this world of the university that's just ready to reinforce all of those disempowering practices, and so they go and report to the dean. I mean, I just think back at college. I didn't know who the dean was. We lived in a dorm. There was a Dr. Gennaro lived on the 16th floor. No one ever saw him or wanted to. Yeah.
Oh, sounds like a made-up name.
No, check it out.
That's great.
Reuben Hall at NYU. Dr. Gennaro. He had nothing to do. He lived there with his family.
Yeah.
We were there, but he was the dorm officer. He had nothing to do with anybody in that dorm, and that's how we wanted it. Now, on every floor, you have these very, what do they call, like college life officers?
Yeah, usually I think still resident assistants.
Resident assistants, and that's growing. It's the fastest growing area of student life, and all of these hall monitors, and they don't have a lot to do because they shouldn't have a lot to do, but now they do because they're constantly going to them to intervene.
And it shows, like, as far as like a big sort of discontinuity among generations, the big fight in the 60s and 70s to a degree was over in loco parentis.
Right.
Like basically like these hall monitors are not my parents. But what we spot in the book, and we're very thankful to, I always get their first names messed up, but Manning and Campbell wrote this book and this article about victimhood culture. And we thought what was more descriptive of it is moral dependency, where essentially all conflict has to be mediated through a third party. And we can sort of scoff at that, but if you look at some of the environments some of these students are growing up in, that's the way it's always been. You always go to adult. You don't try to settle it one-on-one. And that leads to a situation in which you're kind of demanding in loco parentis. And something that we've heard from employers who are hiring recent graduates is that that rather than ever talk out a problem with, or at least for some students are just fine and not overwhelmingly affected by this, but a real uptick in students saying, or new employees actually going to HR rather than try to resolve their
right. We've all dealt with this. Well, I mean, I grew up in the 70s. I'm a Gen Xer too, so we grew up with pretty much no parents at all, even though they were loving
and I
parents.
grew up with even less parents than people for my generation. The joke was and it was kind of true, my friend John had to call home by midnight, Josh had to be home by 1, and Greg has to be home by Tuesday.
Well, this is, you tell these stories to your kids, which we do frequently, and you sound like those pioneer parents. Well, I walked through the snow in bare feet, but it's really true. And
Yeah.
I just
It was
had
kinda
this.
great.
It was
Mostly.
fantastic. We
It
never
had occasional downsides.
Yeah, there were
But we
some
never
downsides,
thought that our parents didn't love us. But I literally had this conversation the other day with a school psychiatrist, and this actually goes to your point about even if you're a parent who's trying not to do this, you have all these institutional forces around you looking shocked at your parenting techniques when you let a kid walk to school by themselves. And in this case, this therapist was kind of surprised that, our daughter is 16 going on 17, that she would call and make her own doctor's appointments. And she said, I honestly have not met any parents who have their child do that. And I said, well, look, my daughter, she's a third child, she's very organized. I don't know her schedule. Why wouldn't she make her own appointment?
It's crazy.
And I'm thinking, and then I'm saying, when I was 11, I went to the dentist by myself on the subway. And she was like, well, this is the first I've heard of a parent doing that. And then you feel like, oh my gosh, I must be you're just trying to inculcate responsibility, especially for someone who is 16. I mean, she's not 10.
Yeah.
And so, but you talk about this entire force of society, and just as when we grew up, that force was, they're fine, let them be kids and just make sure they come home at night. We did have cell phones. I mean, we've gone so degree to the other way, but it's been done by those of us who grew up without these rules.
Yeah.
There's some weird, what do you explain, how did our generation become the big enforcers?
We try to. I like a lot of things, I see a lot of problems that I deal with. I tend to agree with Steve Pinker that political correctness is basically an overcorrection, where it's basically it came from a good place and it achieves some good things, but ultimately it goes too far and drives everybody nuts. I tend to think of a lot of I wrote a short book called Freedom from Speech back in 2014. I
love that book.
Thank you. I felt like it was one of my better things because I wrote it in 3 weekends, so I didn't have time to
Oh my goodness, really?
It's always the best things, the things you write. They're passionate.
Well, it was one of these things. I started explaining it. I just kind of thought everybody. Basically, the theory is that a predictable aspect of progress would be that we actually become less tolerant of free speech, partially because of the whole idea of the post-materialist society, that people are naturally drawn into communities that reflect their values. You say that from the point of view of the 1970s, like Ronald Englehart did, and that sounds like utopia. With less industrialized cities, we have greater physical mobility, greater technological options. That means I can meet someone who shares my passion for comic books, or for particular comic books, for X-Men 133. It can be
X-Men.
What's that?
You like X-Men?
Oh, of course, yeah. Well, 133 is the one where
and 133
Wolverine's on his own. But the idea now, but of course, we now see that there's a dark side to that. That essentially, and the social science, on what happens when you get people who are like-minded together, it tends to create an us versus them sort of what we ended up calling a polarization cycle in the book. What I really wanted to call a polarization spiral. Mm-hmm. Long story short, I see this as a problem of progress, and that it's great that we have the luxury of being able to care so much about our kids, but unfortunately, left to our own devices, we can way overdo it, and we're currently way overdoing it. In the process of looking into parenting, one thing that did give me a little bit more understanding of why the safest generation of students, probably of people, of children in human history, would be raising their kids as if they're growing up in war zones. I found one thing that seemed to kind of explain it to some degree, which I also knew but hadn't really made the connection. I'm the age of people having kids. I'm a little bit older, but most of us grew up in an atmosphere where it was pretty predictable that every year things were actually going to get a little bit worse. Up until, the murder rate didn't start going down until 92, 93. Mm-hmm. And of course, nobody really noticed until about 95, about 95 maybe. And nobody really thought it was going to last. So everything from accidents to, we're also painfully aware of all the kidnapping cases, partially because they were suddenly on milk cartons.
And those weren't even they were parents. A lot of them were not. The thing we all fear, the random stranger.
It's the least common crime.
Right. It's extremely uncommon.
Very, very rare. It's parents in custody fights.
Overwhelmingly, yeah.
And runaways.
And runaways who overwhelmingly come home. But we do have this idea that it's rampant, everywhere, and we address that in the book. But the one realistic sort of idea that they could believe that they're growing up in a much more dangerous time than they are is that during their childhood things were getting more dangerous for all the way up until the mid 90s. So we try really hard to figure out like how people could think this. But now once you tell everybody, it's actually in terms of accidents, in terms of even their abductions were never high, but they've even gone down. In terms of murder rates, it's back to depending on the year.
Assaults, muggings, everything down.
Everything is
historic lows.
Everything is way down. We can loosen up a little bit. Now, the part that hasn't, that they can still, of course, argue, is that the competition to get into the fancy schools hasn't let up. I definitely have.
Worse.
I have real sympathy for that, but at the same time, I don't think we're doing students any favors by actually infantilizing them and deciding their lives for them before they get in.
I want to go back to the anxiousness and depression and the effects of social media, because I just found this so fascinating. I'd never seen it put together so well as in your book.
Oh, great.
So when we go into our daughter's room at night, she's doing her homework, my husband jokes she's got all her friends as prisoners in little boxes around her because they're all online together. They're all doing their homework together, except for her, everybody's virtual. So you had both a part about, I think you went back to Neanderthals, about like humans as social creatures that need for real interaction, not just screen time.
Yep.
And then you went to that correlation that with every hour goes up your potential to have anxiety and depression. So can you talk a bit about us as social animals?
Sure.
And then...
Yeah, I mean, that immediately gets me back to the state of nature arguments. We always talk about, John Locke's state of nature versus Rousseau's state of nature. And the thing they were absolutely the most wrong about was the idea that we're solitary. We are intensely social animals. A lot of our psychological problems are caused by the fact that we take over, systems designed for fight or flight, for survival, and apply them to situations that are merely social. Now, but I say merely. Your body doesn't think of them as merely.
What do you mean by fight or flight to social situations?
That essentially, like in the ancestral environment, like if you're actually socially ostracized, you're good as dead.
So there's a lot of anxiety and adrenaline. You're panicked, and now that can be triggered all day long. Your phone will tell you there's constant feedback. Especially you put something up and you wait for the response and you don't know and it's negative. And with teenagers, and they're still forming a sense of who they are, and then they have to hear all the negative feedback. And I'm glad I was spared that.
Oh my God, yeah. Well, I mean, when I try to explain it to people who are skeptical, I just say, okay, imagine the worst aspects of junior high school, 24 hours a day, forever.
It's like when cable news took over. I remember in adolescence that we had to share a phone with our parents.
Yep.
And you got home and you watched TV and what was on TV. You didn't have a choice. And now this goes 24/7. But you wrote very compellingly of why this hits girls more adversely than it hits boys.
Yeah, it's partially different forms of aggression. That John was really eloquent explaining this, that female aggression tends to be more relational.
Yes.
And that
boys, it's physical, and they usually get over it quickly.
Yep.
And with girls are more inclined to ruminate.
Yep.
Well, they compare themselves. They're like social media, and with the advent of filters. I mean, we were worrying about what models effect in magazines have on female psyche, but now you're watching your best friend,
your peer.
Your peer look amazing.
Peers have a much bigger influence.
Absolutely.
People don't really identify with the models. That's another world. But your friends, you're constantly comparing yourself.
And you have that fear of being left out that you talked about, that girls, as you said, boys can usually settle things more aggressively, but girls, as we know, and we'll get in trouble for just making these distinctions, but are more manipulative. They try and wreck reputations. They're more,
and they do
it
your best
on
friends. I had two
social
best
media.
friends, but we'd pair off against the other.
Right.
And once in a while, they'd pair off against me.
But we've seen this. I mean, I see this among my daughter, her peers, that they launch trollish social media campaigns against each other.
Yeah.
ways that, I mean, boys don't do this, or boys can aid and abet it.
Yeah. Well,
But-
and to be clear, we're not. I don't let boys off the hook.
No,
at all.
but why are girls more affected? Because they seem to be way more into this.
I just want to say one thing about not letting boys off the hook. To understand kind of like my own childhood, like when boys went at it, one of my friends stabbed someone else. Like actually, one of my friends got stabbed in the chest. You know, like the relational kind of actual physical violence is ugly and it's not preferable.
Scary.
and it's terrifying. But thankfully, all of that's really way down. But when you look at sort of like the different ways in which girls, particularly like junior high age, high school age, do show aggression, it's all stuff that is incredibly, unfortunately, well facilitated by social media that can actually be used in a really nasty kind of cruel way. And I think about some of like the nastier fights you saw among young women and girls in grade school and high school. I shudder to think what some of the meanest girls I knew growing up would do with some of this technology.
So you've got us depressed. My anxiety and depression levels are up.
I'm feeling pretty good because I only meant to have a sip of this.
Saint Germain.
Did you mean for me just to sip it?
No, you can have the whole bottle. It's just a little bottle. So what do we do? So you end your book sort of on an up note, advice to parents, advice to colleges. So let's start with me, parent.
Yep.
What do we do? Do you have to like start imposing limits on?
Well, we need to find a
social
new
like-
planet.
Okay. Oh. Oh man, you didn't tell me that.
Tell because I love this concept, and everybody needs to know about anti-fragile.
Oh, anti-fragility, yeah.
Anti-fragility.
So I was a little nervous about mentioning Nassim Taleb in the book, even though both John and I are like huge fans of his. He can be a little,
Yeah.
a little mercurial, and sometimes I'm like, do I really want his attention if he decides he doesn't like me? But we love the concept of anti-fragility. I probably read that book 3 times, and it's kind of amazing that we don't have a word for what he means by anti-fragility. Real quick, we have obviously words for things that are fragile. We have words for things that are robust, resistant to damage, but we don't have a single word up until anti-fragility for something that actually gains from knocks and from stressors, but also relies on them so they actually are harmed by having no stressors or no knocks. And this is interesting because human beings
Or
living...
bones. You know, if you just your bones get stronger.
Yeah.
If you're testing them
But,
With your muscles.
But if you take away gravity, it's like one thing about how dramatic, like how much damage astronauts experience from zero G's and how quickly it is a great example of that. But also, to borrow from our friend Jonathan Rausch, liberal science, like the way we talk. The scientific method is an anti-fragile system that essentially you have to keep knocking it if you want it to produce better ideas. So anti-fragility is this idea, and this is something that when people say this, when they want to sort of stereotype or book or dismiss us, they usually say, so your point is that kids are fragile. I'm like, actually, we're saying that kids are naturally anti-fragile. We are lying to them about them being fragile, and unfortunately, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's the real scandal. And the problem is, like when you're kind of making fun of yourself for saying back in my day.
Yeah, back in my day.
Is that we've so back in my day, we've used that so much that we actually kind of forget that, people from previous generations who had it harder than us, flat out. Can actually teach us wisdom about lives. So occasionally, I had some fun answering this one critic for the original Atlantic article saying, oh, this is another, back in my day argument. And my response was, it's like, okay, well, first of all, it's not for the following 10 reasons. But by the way, our grandparents had it harder than us, like to a person. And they gained some wisdom out of that we could actually learn from.
Right. We don't want to go back to, smoking indoors, not wearing seatbelts, things like that. But you also, I thought one of your perfect examples of this, and I remember this because my children were in nursery school when this was going on, my elder children.
Kabangers?
The peanut allergy scare.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And this was such a perfect illustration because as every parent who has ever had to pack a lunch, and if your children went to Jewish school and you were told they couldn't have peanut butter and no meat, it was cheese sandwiches every day. You were just stuck. There was nothing you could do. But that came out in the mid-2000s.
Yep.
And so peanuts were banned everywhere. Even though the percentage of a single child who might have a deathly peanut allergy was maybe 1 per school, if that. But then they did this experiment, correct me, I'm just, that those who were protected from peanuts for a certain period of time, 17% developed allergies from those who were not protected from peanuts. And only 3% of them developed allergies to peanuts. Meaning it's what we've learned about your immune system. The more dust and dirt you're allowed to crawl around in as a baby.
That's a theory about why there are so many kids with allergies
Hygiene theory, yeah.
and even asthma is too protected from germs.
Right,
That
but-
you develop a child.
and
You can
this
be a
is
bad
happening.
housekeeper, which
Yep.
I was, and it turns out it was good for.
It was good that we were filthy back in the day. But this is the point, right? And
Yep.
when you do this psychologically, when
Yep.
you try and protect, it's a
You sterilize.
psychological immune system that you're
sterilize the whole
damaging.
environment. I never got to the point about what you can do as parents, and the problem
part of it.
The problem is it's difficult to do it as as a lone parent. What I mean, but at the same time, at least I have 2 kids under 3. I live in a block where there are other young parents. And
You have our sympathies.
well, but there is greater awareness now of of the fact that we are doing something wrong by trying to overprotect our kids, and we want to join together with the other parents and make it okay for them to hang out in the park just like we did. John's been, when we do talks together recently, has been talking about how pretty much everybody prior to my generation and up until iGen, they were out and about between the ages of 5 and 8.
Yeah.
Like I was walking down to the store to buy myself comic books when I was 5.
Yeah.
And it was highlight of my life. But when we ask when you were first let out as kids to people who are under 25 or under, the hands are consistently 10, 11, 12. And it's like, whoa, that's crazy. And there's no real justification for that. It's a less dangerous world. We can have free range kids, but there may be really serious harms to not allowing for that really sort of critical period between 8 and 12 for kids to actually manage some navigating their own lives on their own. But in order to do it, you have to make sure that your kids have someone to play with. So that's why you got to talk to other parents to have a little group that's like, listen.
Well, as I understand, the biggest danger that has increased from our time in the 70s to now is the number of cars on the street.
Yeah.
So rather than worrying about, is your child going to be snatched
Right.
by a stranger, really street-proof them against traffic.
Mm-hmm.
Learning how to cross the road is really important.
Yep. There are fewer drunk drivers, too.
But, traffic, busy streets,
Yeah.
that's a legitimate worry. It still shouldn't stop you
Yep.
from sending your children out, but it's which they also, I remember a friend of mine who's, one of our kids had a friend who was 12. Her mother would not let her cross the street.
Mm-hmm.
It was only a mildly busy street
Right.
that she would have to cross to get to our house, which was like 2 blocks away.
Yep.
And I remember saying to the mother, well, when do you think she'll be able to cross the street by
Right.
herself? Like if not at 12, when? And I tried not to say it sarcastically, but
Yeah.
really?
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing.
Did you say 12?
12.
Oh, my God.
She was not allowed to walk to our house 2 blocks away because she had to cross a moderately busy street.
Julia Lithcott-Hames, who I mentioned before, who we quote in the book, we did an interview with her, says, so what's your long-term strategy here?
Yeah.
And it actually turns out we're seeing some of it from students who are going to college, and they're still relying on their parents to run every decision.
They call home every day.
Right.
Yeah, and it's like it's one of these things where it's part of me, like I love my little kids so much, like the idea of being able to be part of their lives for a long time. That sounds, at some level, in theory, swell, but you're disempowering them. You're teaching them that they can't actually handle their life on their own.
All right, well, let's go back. So advice to parents,
Yep.
let up, relax.
Relax a little bit. And actually, if you do want your kids to get into some of these fancy schools, it's probably better for them to, in some cases, do a little less. Definitely. So I talk about, whenever I talk about 2 things that really made an impression on me for the research in this book, one is, of course, the depression and how dramatic it's written. The other one, which was positive, was how well established it is that unstructured time, unstructured play is incredibly valuable for kids. I mean,
For imagination.
For imagination. Erica Christakis, who we interviewed for the book, wrote a wonderful book called The Importance of Being Little, and the book is practically screaming, this is really important, and we're doing the exact opposite for a generation. So unstructured playtime, it doesn't always have to be them running to soccer. It's really crucial for them to develop that sense of being an individual and
or
creativity.
even figuring out what they like. They might not even like soccer, but
Right.
they're being driven to it every week.
Right. And also, the opportunity, if you think of it that way, to get into conflict with other kids, and we don't mean like shooting them, but we mean
Some places,
figuring
some
out-
leagues.
We don't. That's the kind of safety we believe in.
No guns at soccer.
Exactly. But at the same time, kind of like that's how we get into this moral dependency situation where people haven't learned how to interact with each other.
So if you've told us about parents and they have to just back off a little bit. But what about colleges?
Oh boy,
Is there anything that can be done?
So much.
I was
Are
thinking
they a
about that
lost
this morning
cause?
because my colleague Sam Abrams just did a study about the sort of agenda-driven schools, you know, that are very carried away with safe spaces and trigger warnings.
Yep.
And he finds that a lot of it is coming from the student life, the dean, the administration. We talked about that before. And I was just thinking, would there be a lot of these administrators are nice people. They're well-intended. They've learned this. They think that they have to protect the students from microaggressions and so forth. I was thinking, what maybe fire should have workshops, or maybe we should have First Amendment deans in every school.
Right.
Of course, I don't want to increase the administration, but have you thought of any way to break through?
So here's the frustrating thing for me is that, fire was founded in 1999. We celebrate our 20th anniversary next year. And if you look at our agenda around 2012, or for that matter, 2005, our goals were lower the number of speech codes, get rid of them as best we can, get a seat at the table with university presidents and administrators, get the Department of Education to calm down.
Right.
Because the students, and we've accomplished all of these. We're not completely done with speech codes, but when we first started evaluating these, about 75% of universities had crazy unconstitutional speech codes, and now only about 30% do. And it's improving, partially, but there's been 70 plus lawsuits. Now we do get consulted by university presidents, so we've achieved so much of what we wanted to get done in 2012, but this latest round coming from the students has a lot of people saying, oh, there's nothing to be done, we throw up our hands, we're giving up. And whenever I lecture about this, when I'm in a fatalistic room, I'm kind of like, well, we've won on all these other fronts. This is a relatively new problem for us, and we haven't really even begun to address it yet. So, I ask people to put up their hands, like, how many here donate to their alma maters? Practically all the school hands go up. And I'm like, do any of your schools offer anything in orientation that explain freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry, academic freedom as good things and as a deep philosophy? And pretty much nobody does. A lot of schools still have speech codes. There are presidents who really kind of want to, university presidents now who would love to be able to make a name for themselves, to be able to be actually the one that still has like the rigorous school that University of Chicago has been trying to distinguish itself as. So there's so many basic things you can do, and both by checking out the Heterodox Academy website and the FIRE website.
Heterodox Academy.
And we want to get students excited about this because, we can't really blame somebody if the first time, if they've been told their whole life being offended is one of the worst things that can happen to them, that they act accordingly if that happens to them. If you have someone instead tell them on the first day, if you're never offended here, if your ideas are never challenged here, which is what happens when you're offended, you should demand your money back. Like this is supposed to be difficult if we're doing it right.
But don't they then get in trouble? And that's the problem. And as we're dealing with this generation of students, maybe even though, maybe they've been disempowered by their parents, but they don't want this. They want their safe spaces with one of the coloring books, right? There was coloring
books and bubbles at Brown. Julius,
maybe they
Judith
just...
Shulevitz reported on
that article was well. Some of them do, but I took some reassurance in the Hidden Tribes survey report that came out last week. This was one that talked about how it was one of these studies where it so perfectly correlated with my actual professional and personal experience that I was only suspicious of it just because of my own confirmation bias. But I looked into it, and it seems, it's impressive methodology. And they went around talking to people all over the U.S. about, ideas on freedom of speech. What do you think? How do you react to the term political correctness? And there was only one constituency that actually had a positive impression of what political correctness meant. And it was about an 8% that otherwise also distinguished itself as being what the report dubbed progressive activists. That makes up about 8% of the population. It was actually the least racially homogeneous.
It was almost all white.
So basically
white,
all white.
Upper middle class.
And upper middle class kids. And I'm like, that's exactly my experience, that essentially this is a relatively small minority. I'm not sure how much you can do for someone who thinks that they're acting as a hero every time they censor somebody. But I don't believe that's most students. And I think that a lot of students would be relieved to hear, a faculty member explaining, by the way, this is supposed to be difficult. And I think it really should be a faculty member explaining this during orientation, because I think actually part of the problem is faculty have given way too much of the educational experience, the educational duties up to administrators. And we saw, of course it was quite some time ago, but the University of Delaware case that I talk about in my first book on Learning Liberty, absolute nightmare program. And when the faculty found out about it, they were furious about it because it was so dunderheaded, but also because it's like, and this is an educational program and you didn't consult with the faculty well. And the response from administrators was essentially, well, we're doing the real education here. So faculty have to be pushing back against these and start taking over.
Well, that was the point of tenure, I thought. But you pointed out that, and this may be now a problem of tenure, that the number of self-identified politics of professors has spiked since 1990 in favor of those who would describe themselves as far left and liberal, with a big decline in the middle of the road.
Yep.
And far right and conservative.
That was something that I didn't know before working with John, because I just took for granted that universities lean to the left. There's no big shock there, even though people seem to think that it was like the universities were conservative in the 50s. It's like, no, they still lean to the left. But what happened in the late 90s, which I didn't know, was just this massive explosion of in terms of the disproportionate representation of liberals versus conservatives. So we end up with departments that aren't 2-to-1. They're 11-to-1. They're 20-to-1. They're 30-to-1. John the other day talked about some places where there's no Republicans whatsoever at major schools, and particularly in specific departments.
And so is it being fueled to the worst by the current political climate too? That probably doesn't help.
It doesn't help. I think social media sped everything up, and I think polarization, my theory in freedom from speech was that polarization was going to get worse due to otherwise positive features. But social media and Trump have sped everything up.
Well, Greg, thank you so much for coming and being heroic and stoical and coming when you're under the weather.
He is heroic.
Thank
and
you.
No, really, it's my favorite.
If not totally coherent.
No,
you were totally if that's your incoherent,
that's my incoherent.
Mucinex mode, we can only envy it. The book is The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure, by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. And what a great book. I just want to emphasize how readable it is. It really brought everything together in a very lucid, exceptionally readable way. I can't recommend it enough.
Thank you so much.
So thank you for...
John was a fabulous person to write a book with.
Oh, I envy you.
Well, you guys seem to... I could tell. I could tell. There was a bit of a buddy movie going on in this book, and that was a nice thing. So anyway, thank you, Greg.
Thank you so much for having me.
An excellent mansplainer. Thank you.
Yes, he's a mansplainer. Oh, before you go.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you don't drink? We're going to ask you your favorite cocktail. We got another non-drinker. What do we do, Christina?
Well, I mean, my favorite cocktail is a martini. I don't drink for periods of time.
Okay. But when you do, it's a martini.
It's a martini.
All right, so I can have another shot.
All right, well, thank you.
Well, take good care of my baby. Be just as kind as you can be. And if you should discover that you don't really love her, just send my baby back home to me.
I am such a fan of Greg Lukianoff and Fire and Jonathan Haidt. Whenever they speak, I try to attend or find YouTube lectures, and they're just two excellent guys.
I know. Did you come away from that like hopeful or despondent about this younger generation? I mean, I am hopeful that they do seem way more responsible.
Yeah, but there are some good things about them. We can't forget that.
Right.
They are more responsible. I don't know, maybe. I wonder if, in the end, people adapt and have to grow up. I don't know, though. Maybe they'll change the whole world. And I used to think, this will go away, this coddling, temperament when they get into the workplace. But, if I look what's happened in some workplaces, they're changing the workplace and they're running to HR. And now HR is going to act like the deans. And parents come into the workplace and parents have called bosses and things.
Well, I remember sitting next to the great Irving Kristol at some dinner years and years ago. And I was very agitated by whatever was going on then. And I said this to Irving Kristol, who was at that point still pretty old. And I said, what are we going to do about this? What's going to happen? And he said, well, in a few years, they'll be dead.
Oh, God.
And I said, but what about, there's still then the next generation, and they believe blah, 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 and that's bad. And he goes, they'll be dead too.
Well, I guess that's cause for cheer. Someone said that. Someone came and was addressing all these problems with the tax on free speech, and at that time, he was blaming it on the baby boomers. And he said, the good news is soon they'll all be dead. And then I thought, yeah, but the bad news is I'm a baby boomer.
I know.
So I'm not entirely concerned. But I don't know. I think...
Well, we have to, the fact that we have to adapt to these screens, and iGen is this first generation, they're crash test dummies on this. And we as parents, I think, can start trying to monitor this better and not take it
it's like
for
when
granted.
they discovered x-rays and people thought it was a game and, would go to have like a toy, take x-rays all the time. Then they found, oh, it's dangerous.
Right.
We may discover and be shocked at how we allowed ourselves.
Well, I'm then going to start staging an intervention on you, Christina.
On Twitter?
No, we got to get you off your screen.
I know. And it's good for me. I don't really believe it's bad. I think we're just evolving and our brains are going to merge with technology. It's a new stage.
Well, that being said, we went long this week, so we don't have time for listener
Oh, we had great
mail.
letters, but we'll do them next time.
Yes, and we have. What I love is people are now starting to write to us for romantic advice.
Oh, well.
So we can put on our mom hats.
We'll do that.
Answer. But yes, so please keep writing to us. We promise next week we'll devote much more of our episode to your thoughts and feedback. You can reach out to us directly, contact@femsplainers.com or over Twitter @femsplainers.
And like us on iTunes or...
Like us on iTunes. Like our Facebook page @femsplainers, because our likes there are pathetic.
Oh,
And
come on. We have to improve our
we have to
Facebook
improve our
game.
Facebook likes, and you can send us messages there or follow us on Instagram @Femsplainers Podcast, and we're now starting to put up videos. And we also, by the way, Christina, I don't know that I've mentioned this to you, but we had one person send in a video question from Turkey in the summer. Really lovely girl from Turkey who poured herself a cocktail and asked us a question by video. And I love this. I'm going to reach out to her and ask if it's okay to post it, given the climate there right now, because her question was very interesting, but maybe too interesting. But if you feel like you just want to post a question to us
And send a cute video with your cocktail of choice.
with your cocktail of choice and just hang out with us and ask a question. Try keep it under a minute. We would love to answer you that way. So join us virtually or tune in next week.
Okay.
Be a Femsplainer. Bye-bye.